We've sort of wanted to have you so we could have a global perspective on the Eurozone crisis, and I know that partly means what the world is worried about when it looks at the Eurozone crisis, but I'm hoping also why we shouldn't necessarily think that the worries in Greece will infect the whole of the global economy, maybe because there are other things that we should be worrying about. I mean, Jim, where do you think we stand now? I mean, if things look like we might have another year of not just malaise in Europe, but another sort of phase of the crisis, how bad does that have to get for it to start to endanger the global recovery? Or do you think that that really the global recovery is doing okay?
Well, let me throw in a couple of statistics here, and you keep emphasising the nerdiness, so one can do that here more than at most conferences. But we've just had a whole slew of countries' Q1 GDP data, and it's been a whole mishmash. And I've just come back from a quick dash around the US, and I reflect on it that some of the perceived most weakest places in the world have so far coped rather well and positively surprised. Russia, I'm always told it's the one I'm supposed to drop out of the BRIC acronym, 4.9% GDP growth Q1. And Europe is relevant for them as well as it is for the rest of us, and that's quite interesting. Japan, much derided Japan, which I frequently spend a lot of time doing as well, 4.1% annualized, stronger than the US in Q1. Japanese consumer at the core of it. And dare I say it at a Google event, but your friendly competitor in some ways, Apple, probably the most interesting anecdotal corporate information I've seen all year. Completely blew the markets away in Q1. Why? 20% of the revenues to China. So we do need to keep it in perspective. And I'll just throw on other thing in about inside Europe itself. Most interesting thing for me the past fortnight since the French and German Greek elections is not really the Greek situation. It's the Germanic policy response to the French results. You have Finance Minister Schäuble talking about deliberately encouraging higher wages. Weekend just gone, IG Metall, the biggest public sector wage union, settled at 4.3%, a major shift. And through gritted teeth, perhaps, the Bundesbank acknowledging that German inflation has to rise. So,
given a choice between the two things they care about most, price stability and European integration, it does look, optimists would say maybe they're choosing Europe over price stability, or at least allowing some inflation.
Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah. Diana, I know you have thoughts about the sort of broader situation, but obviously since you have just arrived from the States, I was struck talking to some of my former colleagues from the Clinton administration who are now in Washington back again, how earlier in the year, when it looked like the Eurozone had reached a sort of chronic phase, it was no longer threatening to really blow up, it seemed, but could just put Europe in a rather bad place for a long time. This was obviously a great relief to American officials, and you got the sense that they felt they didn't have to play nursemaid to the Europeans anymore. They could sort of disengage. As long as there was no crisis before the November election, they could sort of not worry too much about Europe. I suspect the last few weeks they've had to change that view. Do you think that there is now a real concern in America that something could blow up the financial system before November?
Yes, I think you're right that it's been a bit of a journey where many of you recall at the beginning of this whole, back 2008, 2009, when it looked like this was a US crisis and Europe sat back and said, oh, those American banks and that American economy, there was a quick reversal on that. And I think for a while, exactly as you say, Stephanie, there was a sense of, look, the worst has been contained. Somehow Europe is going to muddle through. We can get back to what's happening now. In reality, the situation in the US is positive, but it's precarious. I think what the positive news has been that post the stimulus, because basically most of the $800 billion Recovery Act money has been largely spent. That which will be spent has been spent. We see growth coming primarily out of the private sector. And so there was a sense of contain that, we can focus on what's on here. I think the reason that has changed, and I think it comes with the experience that both the Fed and the Treasury had back in 2008, 2009, is get very, very close to a new financial crisis, a new banking crisis, which is the fear that we all have about Europe right now. And you realize that has no containment. There is no containment. And the exposure that US banks have, that the whole US capital market system has to Europe is too great. So I think that's what's brought it back on the agenda. I think that the view that whether it's Greece, ultimately Spain, had a true run on the banks, that has just absolutely brings us right back to 2009. And that was a very scary place to be, I can tell you.
I mean, obviously, the big divide across the Atlantic in many ways throughout this has been the attitude to austerity and to just how long you could run these enormous deficits. I mean, there is the irony that Germany sort of quietly did quite a lot of stimulus right at the heart of the crisis, more than many people realized at the time. I think the Germans always feel they have to keep it even from their own population, because German population is so worried about borrowing that if they see the government borrowing, they'll immediately stop spending themselves. So it's the opposite of other countries. But they were very quick to pull that stimulus back. And it's been this constant division at the G8 summit this weekend and other places. I mean, Jim, do you think there has to be a change in the sort of attitude to the fiscal policy in Europe coming out of what's happening in Greece? Do you see that happening? Or do you think it's actually America that's just in cloud cuckoo land running these deficits for as far as the eye can see?
Everybody's in cloud cuckoo land. Best place to be, particularly Chelsea fans this Monday. Yeah, I think in the context of looking beyond, and going back to what I just joked about, never let a good crisis go to waste, there are some signs of things changing significantly. And Neil touched on an aspect of it, which is one of the real modern day problems, that one of the consequences of the power of a Google and the form of technology we have. Everybody wants an instant solution, but you stand back from not just this crisis, but also 2008, you know, the fact that Apple has 20% of its revenues to China, the fact that Chinese industrial production has slowed to less than 10%, which is inappropriately scaring people. Chinese retail sales growing at 14.1%. Chinese current account surplus probably not much more than 2%. Germany showing evidence of a private sector, domestic demand-led recovery. After years of people fantasizing about it, there are signs of German real estate prices starting to rise. So I'm sure virtually nobody will believe this, but I wouldn't be surprised if we look back in a few years and realize that we're having parts of the world swapping places with each other. And you've got China and Germany starting to consume more and produce less, and other places doing the opposite. And that's what it's all about, really. In terms of the absolute world struggling the way that people emotionally talk about, the Eurozone, after all, itself, in the first quarter was slightly stronger than people expected because of Germany. So yes, there's very severe pockets of adjustment going on, but the notion that the world is falling apart again, it's not, as of yet, evident to me.
So you asked where the headspace of America are, and I would offer a few observations.
So don't think that everything's going to be all right.
I'm probably a little less sanguine than you are, but I share your sense that if you zoom out of Europe for a moment, it feels much less dire, and the US is in a much better place, but I see it very vulnerable to Europe. But I think a couple of perspectives from the US, particularly closer to the eye of the storm there, is we were guided during the policy reactions of 2009 in particular by the conviction, and I wish Europe had this conviction earlier, that the people who talk the most about moral hazard are the people who in the end write the biggest checks. And that is just a pattern of observation. The decision that was made in the US very early on, before you all recall the 3 pages that Hank Paulson walked into Congress with, he said, we're not really quite sure how, what, where, but front load this and the hell with moral hazard. Yes, it's true that this shouldn't have, wouldn't have, couldn't have, but the reality is now we've got to deal with the situation. I actually think that that was one of the best things that has happened, and it's frightening to see Europe still moralizing on the moral hazard issue, because I think...
But there is a sort of thing at the heart of that, which is about getting the crisis just over with and lancing the boil.
Yes.
And I think when people, that's the kind of talk that has people saying, well, Greece should just get out and then we deal with the consequences.
Okay, so that gets to
Easy
my second
talk,
point.
isn't it?
Easy talk. But here's the other dimension I think we learned, particularly working through the financial reform wars, which, as many of you know, and so too in Europe, just incredibly politically charged, which is when people moralize, when they talk about moral hazard in general, what they want is a single culprit. They want idiosyncratic misbehavior, by which you say, you, Enron, would be a great example of idiosyncratic misbehavior. It was clearly a lot of things that institution was doing that were fraudulent, that were illegal, that were whatnot. And that lends itself very well to moralizing, where you say these people, we're going to punish them, we're going to contain it, we're going to get it over and done with. I think the reality is whatever you think about whether an individual institution should have done what they did, whatever you think about the mortgage situation and the kinds of loans that were made to people who probably shouldn't have been getting those loans, the reality is we do not have, in the US and Europe does not face an idiosyncratic risk. It faces a systemic risk of multiple practices that affect everyone. And so you move from that worldview, which is we want a culprit, we want someone to punish, we want to get it all over and done with by containing one area and putting it aside, and you come to the reality that is our financial system today, and increasingly the broader economy, systemic, you have to talk about a very different set of solutions, which I think are what Neil and Papandreou were describing earlier.
But what do you think, I mean, in a year's time, not 10 years' time, where all of these difficult changes have all somehow happened, what do you think actually we'll be talking about in a year's time? Do you think it will have got worse before it gets better? Will we have had, or will we have had this kind of cleansing period?
Well, I want to reiterate, what we've got here is a crisis of the European monetary system. I strongly agree with virtually everything Neil said earlier. It's not really an economic crisis. It's a crisis about the structure that was put in place of monetary union being wrong. And you've got this financial integration, but you haven't had the rest of it. And in an optimal sense, there probably should only have been 6 countries that joined that really satisfied the true criteria. But because of Europe's history, you couldn't have a monetary union without Italy in. And once that started, floodgates open for everybody else. And I frequently find myself thinking the past 2 years that German policymakers at times have almost been deliberately using the markets to get what they always wanted. And it seems to me we are a lot closer to that than we were a couple of years ago. And I wouldn't be surprised, especially because this time next year is going to be, 5 months before the German election. Something else not being mentioned yet this morning, the North Rhine-Westphalia election, big thing. And the SPD and the Greens are both in favour of Eurobonds. And so you could have, by this time next year, the 3 biggest European governments all in favour of them.
I think that's what a lot of people don't understand, that the shift of the political gravity in Germany has actually been in favour of the more pro-European integration parties in the last year. There's a kind of assumption that the Germans are hating all the bailouts.
Sarkozy disappeared in that sense, even though here in Anglo-Saxon world we might not feel so comfortable with the new French government. But they're much more pro-European than the outgoing Sarkozy ones. So, but in a broader sense, again, coming back, and I want to emphasise this, that this obsession in the Western world with itself, something that was touched on briefly, but I want to add to it. The UN goal of reducing global poverty by 2015 has been reached 5 years sooner than was said. How come that doesn't get talked about? Global poverty has halved way quicker than what everybody thought was a ridiculously ambitious goal. And that's a reflection of what's going on in China, despite their recent troubles, India, large parts of Africa, and parts of Russia, despite the fact we don't like them. And many of these people are doing really well. And they're not sitting around freaking about whether Greece will stay in EMU in another 4 weeks or not. But maybe they should a bit more.
If it's accelerated the changeover in power, the changing of the global economic guard, that is still bad news for Europe. It's not that there's any great positive story for Europe coming out of this, if it's actually increased the sort of, relative decline or accelerated the relative decline of Europe.
Well, if it results in better governance of the system they all believed in so much 10 years ago, maybe it won't end up being a bad thing. Here's another list of things to throw in. I cannot understand, and I wrote this the first time I mentioned the phrase BRICS. What on earth are Germany, France, and Italy participating in G20 and G7 and G8 meetings on their own? It is ridiculous. It is absolute. You could solve parts of this crisis. The Eurobond thing I completely agree with, but it could also show if they announce tonight, as of now, no single European member, Euro area country is participating in any G meeting on their own. We're demonstrating our commitment and solidarity. We're meeting as one. That's easy.
So I'm torn because I sort of want to let you go on because I think we all need some good news. And I love the reduction of poverty, UN goals and otherwise. But I think it's a mistake, honestly, to suggest that this whole story we have here was just a misconstruct of the EU mechanism or the Euro mechanism, although I agree with you, that's a big part of this. And a year from now, I think we will either have strengthened the pact and figured it out and gotten closer to your union, or we'll have a pretty catastrophic breakup, which I think is kind of unlikely for the reasons that Neil put forth. But even if we get that right, or had gotten that right, there were many elements of what was happening in interconnectivity, particularly of capital, and at the same time, the wealth of China, the petrodollars that formed themselves into large pools of capital that allowed very large imbalances all over the world. And we do have a trigger to a lot of this crisis within Europe and certainly around the world was the very high levels of leverage that were enabled by this system. And even if we resolve this thing in the short term, we still have, the US wasn't even part of the EU for that matter, we still have this huge challenge of getting ourselves to a more balanced and less leveraged environment. And I've got to tell you, the history of countries having done that is not very positive.
No country in the world has a current accounting balance. That's fantasy.
Okay, but why don't we get back to the broader, I suspect nerds though they are, I suspect we lose them when we start talking about current account imbalances. Call me crazy. But I mean, there's a broader point which you can sort of talk, I discovered that you can use this on the news. You can talk about imbalances without really talking about them. But if you have all the things that you're talking about, Jim, exciting changes in the global economy. I think, by the way, you are allowed to talk about Apple. It's Facebook you're not allowed to talk about. But all these things that are changing, and history tells us that those periods of massive change of global
he might talk about them.
Distribution of economic power have come with serious political crises, serious instability. The lesson of the euro might actually be bigger than this, and also the way the G20 is managing the last few years, is that we don't have remotely the right kind of institutional tools to deal with the changes, positive as well as negative, that are happening in the global economy. I mean, isn't that, we're going to finish up in a minute, but I mean, do you think that is one big message, one big takeaway that comes from the last few years that is quite worrying, just about the world's ability to adapt to these changes?
Well, if you put 17 countries in a fixed monetary arrangement, you're going to get the volatility one way or another. If you control the currency volatility, it's just going to come out in some other way, unless all 17 of them become exactly the same places. By the way, here's one of the small bits I disagree with what Neil said. You get that in the UK, where Manchester's 38 miles from Liverpool. We're not the same places.
But if 17
we have
countries,
an infinitely better football team than them.
Even
if we didn't win the Champions League.
It goes to Deanna's point, though. If 17 countries that have basically been working together for decades can't sort out the imbalances between them, what does that say about the global
imbalances,
economy?
This particular imbalance is being resolved. China is spending, I'll say them again, get Apple people here. 20% of their revenues in one quarter are from Chinese consumers. What greater evidence do you want? Never mind balance of payments, current account statistics. Germany, record unemployment for 20 years because it's providing what these German consumers, primarily automobiles. That imbalance is now being resolved. We're going to get other imbalances. That's life. The idea that we're going to have some wonderful, harmonious world where there'll never be any imbalances, that's just not realistic.
Diana, last word, but on this sort of broader point, lesson of the last few years.
I guess the big lesson that I would bring from the U.S. is we run the risk of doing too little, not too much. And I think that's the risk that Europe is still running right now.
And that is the difference between America and Europe. Europe always thinks it's going to make a mistake of doing too much. And Americans would always err on the side of excess. Thank you very much to both of you.